Welcome to the benefits of spiraling. Let's start off by talking about what is spiraling. First of all, just a lot of textbooks, a lot of things you'll find online, they'll refer to spiraling when you consider multiple years. Take, for instance, things in math that are taught in the seventh grade is brought back to the eighth grade in a little higher form, and then what's taught in the eighth is brought into the ninth. That's one form of spiraling of content, but what I want to talk about today is actually spiraling content within a given school year. This is when a teacher revisits taught content at a later date in the same year. Also, the content can be revisited within a different project or scaffolding exercises. In other words, you don't necessarily have to revisit it in multiple projects. It can be revisited in a project or within scaffolding later on in the year, or within your assessments. And this is the third bullet here, talking about actually cumulatively testing throughout the year, where you're putting things on the first test, on the second test, and things on the second test, on the third test, and having different some of those items found throughout the school year. Now, one of the things that I use to determine what goes on those future tests is especially if students did poorly on certain ones of the standards or GLEs, those are ones that I would want to continue to put in study guides and continue to assess until we can get the students at the mastery level. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't need to revisit some items that they were successful on early in the year either, as we'll mention here later. Research on spacings. Research has shown that individuals will retain knowledge long term if time is spaced between the study sessions, or when you are giving students content again. Also, it says research has shown that the longer that you want to remember something, the more you should space out your learning. In other words, so if you teach something in the first 9 weeks, and especially if you revisit it, say, in the third 9 weeks, then they should really convert a lot of this knowledge into their long-term memory. Some of the misconceptions that some educators and some people have about spiraling content is first, people don't recognize the benefits of spacing. They often think that's the negative effects. In other words, a lot of times people think if you wait a lot of time in between something, then you're doing harm to them being able to remember it. That they think that you need to do it currently and spend a lot of time on it. A lot of times you can spend 3 or 4 or 5 weeks on an item, and then all of a sudden you get through with that within say 3, 4 weeks, or a month later they can't remember anything that they've been taught. Second, it says people are biased to think their memories won't change much in the future, so they underestimate the benefits of future study. There was a lot of times, as I mentioned earlier, if you think you understand something really well, you don't think you need any more time spent on that. But yet, when you try to retrieve that from your brain, say a month later or 2 months later, and you can't do that, that just proves the fact that we need to do a lot more of a spiraling, where we revisit it at a later date so that it will be concreted into our brain. Third, see, people think that once they recall something, they know it, and maybe they do in the short term. But again, as we've mentioned, they can now, but they may not be able to at a later date. So it's very important that we do this revisiting, because it really helps to put our content, at a long-term part of our brain, so that we can recall that when we need it. Okay, in reflecting over some of the things we've talked about here with spiraling, one thing when I ask the question is, why not spiral your curriculum if possible? And I understand that some contents that have a ton of GLEs, it may be difficult to spiral a lot of different ones of those GLEs, because you've got a lot to cover and you can't afford to have time to revisit those. But especially on the subjects that are able to do so, what would be the reason not to spiral it? Not to give the students an advantage in order to recall that and place that information into the long-term part of their brain. Second question that says, can you think of some of your GLEs that could fit into more than one project? Can you think of several GLEs that really could show back up in multiple projects because they fit? Why not use these GLEs multiple times especially if they mesh into your projects well? All right, could you place items on your current tests that were taught in the past? All right, in other words, is it anything wrong with putting some items that you've tested back at the first of the year, in the middle of the year? And what kind of ways could you give the students heads up, let them know that you're going to do this? Could you give a study guide, or can you give them some concepts that they need to look back over from their past? Have you used learning logs that maybe you could tell them how you need to go back into your learning log and look at this information that you've documented so that you're prepared for this again for the test? Just how can you make this where it's not necessarily a chore, but something that it can work for you and your students as well? Some of my personal experience with spiraling, I know that before we had what we call now the comprehensive curriculum, and even before what we call the model curriculum, I had students that did extremely well when I was teaching and doing cumulative tests. In other words, when I was giving cumulative tests, in other words, I would everything on my first test, I would put certain things on my second, and vice versa, all the way up to midterm. And then I'd start it back over again, and everything on that point on, I would accumulate again. And my students, scored a lot higher than what they've scored over the past, several years on standardized tests, because I truly believe it's because of the cumulative tests that I gave and the spiraling that occurred in my classroom. Again, this does not necessarily mean that you need to reteach every GLE or every standard, but you can kind of use what I would say, test smarter. Look at your assessment guides. Look at the things that we know for certain that's going to be heavily tested, or especially if you've got a certain set of standards that's going to be showed up on your standardized test, say at a 30 or 40%. The test is made up from those categories. Those would be excellent things that we could make sure that we're spiraling. Also, excellent things that we could make sure that we're spiraling is anything that we know our students are not mastering. Okay, and we don't necessarily have to spiral for the entire class. We can even do some individual spiraling for students that we've identified their weaknesses, and we can make the adjustments that needs to be made for those individual students themselves. So just going to leave this with you today is spiraling. I think is something that we need to be looking at, and how we can cover material more than one time throughout a school year, but also how can we address which ones of those items that we need to cover more than once because of either their difficulty of the concepts, or because of the fact that how they're going to be tested in the future, far as more heavily than other items. And even to the individual basis, how can we meet the individual needs and differentiate our instruction and our assessments for these students? Okay, I thank you for spending a little bit of time with me as I have went over some things about spiraling. If you have any questions, be more than happy to answer your questions at a later date. Thanks very much.